Welcome to Humanist Views, a program where we look at current issues from a humanist point of view. I'm Scott Lohman. On tonight's program, we're going to step away from looking at current events and look at something that is good to put into your toolbox and a skill on how to assess things and just a good way to strengthen up your thinking skills on that. So tonight we're going to take a look at just some basics of critical thinking. It's kind of hard to condense something that's pretty much can be taught as a full college course and put it into a half hour, but we're going to summarize it and get you sort of revved up to go out and research and do more information on that. Joining me tonight is Dr. Jerry Smith. Welcome, Jerry.
Thank you.
And you're a college professor and you teach where?
I'm a professor of management at the University of Northern Iowa, which is in Cedar Falls, Iowa.
And you teach critical thinking to college students.
Yes, what I do, in addition to teaching a basic principles of management course, I teach a course, or was hired to teach a course that is entitled Managerial Problem Solving. It covers problem solving, decision making, but the first half of the course is basically a critical thinking course. And so I think of it as a course in thinking effectively. Critical thinking, classically understood, is kind of a subset of that, but an important subset and one that has gotten a lot of attention.
Okay, so let's define what critical thinking is. And I know you poke a number of people and you can get different definitions, but traditionally, how do freethinkers like to look at that?
Well, I think the most common definitions would emphasize the use of evidence to reach conclusions and would talk about that in the context of making and evaluating arguments, using evidence, good reasoning to reach conclusions in the course of making arguments. Now, arguments are ways of persuading people, and we make arguments to other people. In some ways, we make arguments to ourselves in deciding whether or not to accept a certain claim or proposition. But the essence of critical thinking, the heart of it, and the way it's typically taught, would focus on reasoning and the analysis and evaluation and construction of arguments.
So it's sort of getting your mind to think not just what you're passionate about, but learning to assess the evidence and the arguments?
Yes, and I think where the term critical, the way the label critical got on there, was because of a belief when this got started several decades ago, that very often people weren't adequately critical, adequately skeptical. They were too willing to believe, willing to accept what was being told them. And so there's this emphasis on being critical, which has come to dominate the concept in a way that's unfortunate, because it's really about effective thinking. And for me, that's what I focus my teaching and research on.
Is making sure that people then take those basic skills. So what's a good starting point for just on the basics of this?
In my teaching, I started with some fundamentals, and I talk about the nature of thinking per se, and do that from a cognitive science perspective, which emphasizes thinking as the processing of mental representations. The notion that when you think, what's going on in your head and ultimately in your brain is kind of cranking around or processing of mental states that stand for or represent whatever it is you're thinking about. So that's fundamentally what thinking is, the processing of mental representations. I start with that kind of background, talk about different kinds of claims, whether it's an empirical claim or assertion, an empirical statement, whether it's an evaluative or a conceptual claim. It's important for people to understand that kind of stuff. It's important for people to understand some of the what I call cognitive virtues. One of the issues in critical thinking is that it's traditionally been viewed as a skill or as a set of skills. I argue, and this comes through in my research and teaching, that if it is skills, those skills are very what I would say knowledge saturated. There's a lot you have to know to be an effective thinker. And you have to know things about thinking, you have to know things about language and about the world. So there's a lot of knowledge to be had that's essential to being a good thinker. And then over and beyond that, and something that came out in the critical thinking movement really several decades after it got going, was an emphasis on dispositions, or what I call the cognitive virtues, the idea that being a good thinker, good critical thinker, is a matter of having certain habits of mind.
Okay.
And indeed, intellectual values, a concern for rigor in reasoning, a concern for validity, that some would say good thinkers have a passion for truth, a concern for clarity in language. And so, arguably, one important element of being an effective thinker or a critical thinker is having these habits of mind, these values, these cognitive virtues that inform your thinking. Now, the trouble with those is how do you teach them? How do you develop them? And that's the hard part there.
Yeah, so it's got to be, because those are big things that I think doesn't that go all the way back to Aristotle as far as having things written down and trying to look at that, or is this stuff that we've built on since then?
Well, I mean, I think they've been recognized for a long time, but and I think there's a general acceptance of what the major cognitive virtues or dispositions would be. But I don't know that anybody's kind of come up with effective means of developing those either in oneself or in other people, which is important for an educator, other than just practice, other than just doing it and trying to, show it. I mean, in a classroom, you try to illustrate them in your own thinking in front of a class, and you try and respond to it, identify it when you see it in others or when you don't see it in students. You say, well, can you be more clear in your assertion there? You're using language or terms that are too vague. You can challenge that, and through that kind of thing, hopefully get students to develop some of these dispositions and mental values.
And that almost gets up to some of the processes that we see in science a lot as well. Because there, you've got to use those tough skills to evaluate things, and you have to use very specific terminology.
Yes. In fact, in the course I teach, I have a session on science for two reasons. One is because I think it's important for all my students, college students, to understand science. They presumably get it in their general education courses, but unfortunately, often they learn geology, but they don't learn science. But two, because science does have or is based on certain thinking practices and values that are just good thinking. And so you teach that, and hopefully seeing how it's used in science helps students recognize how it can be used in everyday affairs.
So if we're just going to start with just a few basic building blocks, let's say there's a problem we want to assess. What would be things to start with for somebody to just do sort of tricycle critical thinking?
Yes. One of the first places I'd start, I guess, for somebody trying to learn critical thinking would be to try and understand reasoning. And the place to start there, even though it's difficult for many people, is understanding deductive reasoning or deductive logic. But that is a good foundation. It's very formal. There are nice rules. It's very powerful in the sense that if you do deduction correctly and you start from true premises, you're guaranteed to have or reach true conclusions. No other form of thinking has that truth guarantee. Getting people or students familiar with deduction then sets them up to appreciate the wide variety of other kinds of reasoning we do. Analogical reasoning based on similarity. Inductive reasoning, where you're going from specific instances to a more general conclusion. Seen a lot of crows, they were all black. Induction conclude that all crows are black. And when they start to appreciate different forms of reasoning, then they're in a position to start recognizing deficiencies in reasoning, the major of which are sometimes identified as fallacies.
Okay.
And there are 30, 40 classic fallacies that are discussed in most critical thinking texts, but the truth is, if you want to go at it, you can identify hundreds of fallacies that have been identified and labeled by various people, because there are many, many ways in which we make reasoning mistakes. Now, with a foundation of reasoning, if you understand good reasoning and not so good reasoning, then you're in a position to evaluate arguments, because in most cases, the persuasive substance of an argument comes in the reasons that it provides, the way it uses evidence to support or challenge a claim or conclusion.
Okay, so you start with looking at those, breaking it down in a sense to its basics. Is that one way of looking at it, or?
In analyzing an argument, I
Yeah.
would want to, a couple things. Try and identify the reasons that are being given in the argument.
Okay.
In what ways is this person trying to support his or her conclusion? Identify other elements of the argument that aren't giving reasons, but that nonetheless are trying to persuade or influence an audience.
Okay.
And that's what's sometimes called rhetoric. There are things that we do, telling jokes, questionable or fallacious appeals to authority, trying to present oneself as in a nice, favorable way, so you'll like me. If you like me, you're more likely to agree with my conclusion. Well, in analyzing arguments, you want to identify that stuff and set it aside, because I want to focus on the reasons. What have you given me in terms of reasons and evidence, and the evidence is used in the reasons? What have you given me that justifies the conclusion that you're putting forward?
So yes, you start with those things. We also then have some neat fictional characters that like to do that. Does that help at all? Say if we look at, say, the classic characters of Sherlock Holmes and, say, Mr. Spock from Star Trek, are, to me, two characters that sort of epitomize deductive reasoning.
Yeah, Spock would be. I'm not a Trekkie, so I didn't see his stuff, but Holmes is often cited as an example of deduction. Yet, in fact, I would argue that most characteristically, his reasoning was somewhat differently.
Yeah.
There's a famous example in Sherlock Holmes, and I think it was one of the first stories, where Holmes comes to the conclusion that he's just met Doc Watson, and he comes to the conclusion that Watson had been in the British military and in fact had been in India and now had come back for whatever reason. And in doing that, he picks up on various pieces of evidence or things about Watson, and not deductively, because deduction says you've got these things and you're guaranteed to get a true conclusion.
Right.
It's more what is sometimes called, what's the term I want here? Reasoning to the best explanation,
Okay.
where he takes a number of different facts and proposes an explanation. Doc Watson, you must have been a British military officer in India. That explains these various characteristics of you. That's the reasoning he does, but it's classic. It's very powerful. And then he does that kind of reasoning throughout the stories.
The stories, yeah. But it's always been interesting to most of us knowing that Conan Doyle would do that, but then also believed in spiritualism on the side.
Yes.
So it's interesting that you can create a character that does that and still have our own internal weaknesses. So what's a good way around that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, one would argue that if Conan Doyle was consistent and insisted on only forming beliefs on the basis of good evidence, it would have kept him from spiritualism.
Yeah.
However, people aren't consistent.
No.
People have their ins and outs. They have their vulnerabilities. They have prior conceptions. They have things that they want to believe. And those kinds of biases and preferences have a huge effect on our mental ecology. And I don't know, there's a nice way to avoid that except to try. I mean, the best thing to do is make people try to be self-aware. It's called metacognition.
Okay.
Try to help people consciously reflect on their own thinking and the kinds of biases and influences that might be subverting their thinking. No nice way of doing it, but
Yeah, you just I think it helps if you're self-aware to know, I know I tend to look at this stuff, I know I tend to look at that, and finding ways to consciously counter yourself.
Yeah. Was Conan Doyle kind of aware of spiritualism as kind of inconsistent with the rationality that he endorsed in the Holmes stories?
I'm not sure if he was, but I think there was a lot of emotion going on, and I think he got fooled a lot by people who put on a really good show.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that knowing how something is put together. This is why we look at the act of Penn and Teller so interesting, because they do magic, but they also will do a show showing how they did the magic. So they're showing us the illusion of performing a trick and how they will distract us so that you can understand the theater of it. And that's things that people miss when doing that, because then some will talk about even the faith healers on that. So, if faith healing's so good, why does he only do it in front of 50,000 people who've paid $50 a seat to watch him, rather than just going to the hospital and fixing people? Yeah, so you've got that sort of thing. So those are the type of things, if people can get past the theatricalism, I think, some with our modern movies, with now how computer special effects are, we can know, yeah, I know there's not a big space station up in space spinning like that and ships like that, but it's looking so good that it's getting tougher to know when those things are. So then it's understanding where I'm being fooled, and maybe the whole thing is being made up. So that, that's at least one way I look upon thinking about my biases, and looking at that as understanding, things I'd like to know, but then trying to then compensate for that by looking in the hard sciences and that kind of stuff.
That, I might point out, the major development in the study of thinking, and even more specifically in the study of decision making, for roughly 40 years now, has been the identification of individual biases and flaws and shortcomings. And that's been where all the action is. When I was a PhD student, I got my PhD in decision sciences, and I was focused on decision processes, thinking, decision making. They were still teaching the classical kind of formalistic decision theoretic approach, but just starting to recognize the work on biases. But that's the stuff that came to dominate the field, and it's branched out beyond the study of decision making. Now it's very big in economics, now called behavioral economics. It's in psychology, social psychology. There are people all over doing research, identifying ways in which our thinking is corrupted by biases. So that is the dominant kind of research activity, and it's started to have an impact, say, on the teaching of critical thinking, which is, it's coming from a different source, but getting to ultimately to students through courses on critical thinking.
Yeah, so all of this, helps, but we see people we also have to realize that we're also emotional reasoners. Is there something in critical thinking that helps us realize that that's a component of our decision making and thinking?
Well, the emotions, first of all, a big development in the study of human cognition over the past, again, this is about 40 years, has been the recognition of the pervasiveness and powerful influence of emotions. And quite frankly, they are treated as something like biases.
Okay.
In the sense, and it's legitimate, in the sense that very often those emotions are tempting you away or leading you away from rational conclusions, rational courses of action. Now, on the other hand, emotions also are evidence of our values, of what matters to us and what's important. And our thinking and our problem solving, our decision making should certainly be guided by our values. So there's this kind of bifurcation here that emotional influences can be bad, but on the other hand, properly understood and controlled, they're reflecting something that's really important. You really have to have your values in place when you're making, say, purchasing decisions or decisions about what career to pursue. Those emotional reactions are telling you something, and something that you shouldn't ignore.
Yeah, and that's the critical side, because I've read some things where if we look at a classic, Mr. Spock, Vulcan carry, the cold, it doesn't quite work for us as human beings, because it takes some of the things that we need as part of that process out of it.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not a Spock familiar with his stuff, but I wonder what values drove Dr. Spock or Mr. Spock. I mean, was it just pure rationality and whatever values were set by the Starship Enterprise, or what would motivate him?
Yeah, it was he would go for the pure cold logic of things.
But you got to be driving. I mean, that'll get you to a conclusion. What gets you to an action? Because an action needs a goal, needs a motivation. Was his just given to him by Kirk, or where did
some
they
of
come
it
from?
would be that, or solving the problem that they were going. How are we going to get out of this situation? But it's always interesting that they always postulated you could form a society on pure logic. Yet that would probably drive all of us humans crazy. Yeah, it's not something we can do. So looking at, we can bring in an emotional component, but we also have to realize how that can influence us on things. and we're looking at having deduction in there as well. What then are some of the next steps? So what can people then use to run the mental models to evaluate things as they're reasoning their way through it?
Well, again, if we're talking about evaluating arguments, you've got an argument in front of you and you want to identify the lines of reasoning and are they strong, are they solid? If it's solving a problem. I teach problem solving. It's actually my original focus of research. We talk about identifying the problem, defining the problem, analyzing it, identifying problem types and structures. At some point, you may have to generate alternative courses of action. Creativity may come into play there. And then you get to the decision-making phase. We're going to have to decide which of those courses of action are best. But my view is that, at least with problem solving, I think the way potentially we can improve people's problem solving, there are a number of heuristics, good concept for people to have. Heuristic is a quick and dirty method, good piece of advice.
Okay.
And research has shown that most experts in most fields, their expertise basically consists of heuristics. They don't have powerful formal methods. They don't rely on deduction. They rely on practical reasoning, heuristics, good pieces of advice, like a good cook does in making something. So you have heuristics that support your problem definition, problem analysis activity, heuristics that would help you generate creative alternatives, indeed heuristics that might be useful in deciding a course of action, maybe choosing partial solutions, not instead of going for one thing that gets it all, develop or adopt a set of solutions, each of which addresses a part of the problem. That's a useful heuristic strategy in many cases.
Yeah, there was a book that came out a number of years ago called Blink. And that one, to me, was fascinating. And some people were saying, oh, we've got this subconscious that works today. And my reading of it, it was that years of expertise of looking at something pays off when you're looking at something that's right square in your field and trying to figure out what's going on. When you talked about somebody being able to basically identify something as being a fake versus being real by just looking at it and going, it's like setting off a whole bunch of little signs saying something's not quite right.
Yes. Gladwell's book, Blink, was interpreted by many as an endorsement of intuition. And that's a topic that also has gotten some attention in the past several decades, in part because of evidence that we're not aware of a lot of things that drive our thinking. We're not aware that we've often decided on a course of action before we consciously recognize that we've made that decision. I agree that certain people have valid intuitions about certain things, and I think there are legitimate sources of valid intuitions, some that are individualized and others that are species level.
Okay.
At the species level, there's evidence that, for instance, people have an intuitive sense of fairness, widely shared.
Yes.
And I think largely across cultures, in fact. There's evidence that people have an intuitive sense of whether sentences in their native language are grammatical or not. So we have an intuitive kind of grammar. So it's like the instincts of an animal. We have intuitions that are, in a sense, instinctual, passed down through our genes. But more interesting for most practical affairs are intuitions that are at a personal level, are individuated for each person, and that, as you're kind of suggesting, and Gladwell does as well, come from past experience. So a very legitimate notion of intuition says it's kind of the unconscious voice of past experience. You've encountered many, many situations of a certain kind before, and in those situations, and the example I often use, corporate recruiter coming on campus and talking to college students, deciding which of them might be good candidates for employment at his or her company, I could believe that they developed through interacting with many, many students and finding out which ones turn out to be good employees and which ones don't. They develop an intuitive sense, just from somebody's body language, from the way they talk, from all sorts of things that they pick up on but maybe not even are consciously aware of. They'd get an intuitive sense of who would be a good hire for that company.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think there are legitimate intuitions. Unfortunately, though, and I've seen this in the management literature, it's the kind of thing that's easy to oversell.
Oh, yeah.
It's easy to tell managers, oh, yeah, rely on your gut feel, rely on your intuition. Recent former president, said he made decisions based on gut feel. He made some pretty bad decisions. So if you're going to rely on intuition, you've got to be sure that you, in fact, have valid intuitions and ones, and for that to be the case, they have to have a strong experiential base, or there's something that's species level. That's not likely to be the kinds of things that could get you through business decision situations or even practical ones. But if you've got a lot of experience in dealing with something, and experts do, you can have legitimate intuitions where you're not consciously processing, but unconsciously you're getting signals that suggest this person's telling the truth, this person would fit well in our company, be careful of, going into this situation could be dangerous, stuff like that.
Yeah, that's, what I thought he was bringing out is lifetime study in certain areas will definitely cause your brain to be able to work that well. So we're down to the last couple of minutes. So just in sort of a conclusion, what are just some basic things people can start with and do that? And if you know of, say, just a good book off the top of your head that's a good approachable one.
Quite frankly, what I would recommend that people do, if you're interested in critical thinking, pick up a text, but a text that's not current, because they charge you $150 for a current text. You can get an off edition, maybe a couple years old, for $2 to $5 on Amazon.
Okay.
Do that. Good text I would recommend, I forget the name, it's Introduction to Critical Thinking, but by a man named Robert Ennis, E-N-N-I-S.
Okay.
Ennis is one of the more thoughtful scholars in the field. I mean, he's one of the people who not only has written a text, but has also done important research in the field of critical thinking. In his text, I wouldn't say it's the sexiest of the bunch, but it's a good, solid thing. Another book, and I can't remember the authors, smaller but more concise, but also useful. The title is Asking the Right Questions.
Okay.
And again, search that on Amazon.
Yeah, I can
You'll
find
get
that,
it. Get an off edition. It would be good. The text will introduce you to the major topics, and again, they'll give you a lot of stuff. They'll have chapters on deductive reasoning. They'll have chapters on the fallacies, chapters on analyzing and constructing arguments, probably some stuff on language, maybe something on the scientific method. Some of them get into things like decision making and problem solving. Most of them don't. They won't do a lot typically with the psychology of thinking, is something I teach a lot about, but they'll give you a comprehensive kind of thing, and will give you then references to more in-depth treatments of almost any of those topics.
Okay, thank you much, Jerry. It's been a quick half hour, and appreciate you giving us a very broad overview of a very deep subject.
Well, thank you, Scott.
Thanks. And for more information on us, the Humanists of Minnesota, you can find us out at our website at humanistofmn.org. So go there. You can check out previous editions of this program as well as other articles, and you can check on our schedule for events that we have coming up in the future. We'd like to hear what you think about this program, so send us an email or write us a letter. We'd like to know what you think of this program, or suggest topics that you'd like to see us cover in the future. Thank you for joining me on this edition of Humanist Views. I'm Scott Lohman. Good night.